All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the 5 Senses podcast with your host, Robert Zinni. Today, we have published author, amateur political theorist, political satirist, Scott Mancuso, zooming in live from Buffalo, New York. Scott, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, of course, Robert. I'm really happy to have the chance to talk to you here.
Me too. Now, if people don't know Scott, he's my longtime contributor or collaborator from a lot of my projects, a lot of the short films that I've made. Scott has either co-written them, or if I just want it all to make sense, I give it to Scott because he has that English mind brain, satirical brain that really puts a lot of things into context. Some of his well-known publications have been The Life and Times of Grovey Cleves, which is a biography of Grover Cleveland, the president, and one of my favorites, Henry Gansevoort, where it's about moles, talking about two different options of how to get through a mountain. I use that as a metaphor for the two-party system in my government class. So Scott, first off, I just wanted to ask, how do you create short stories that have political metaphors or create political satire?
Well, I guess the way that I try to do it and what I hope I'm accomplishing is to do it in a way that's subtle so that you're not hitting your audience over the head with it. And this is something that goes back all the way to George Orwell, who was maybe one of the forefathers of modern political satire. When you look at something like Animal Farm, and you frame these really big and weighty issues within a context that seems really innocent and like it doesn't have all this connotative value attached to it. Something like using animals, for example, I think is actually a really good way to do that. So with Henry Gansevoort the mole, for example, like you were just talking about, you're able to explore some of these kind of bigger topics that people might already have a lot of preconceived notions about, but you use these very innocent seeming animals in order to get these ideas across, because that makes it a little bit easier for people to set aside their preconceived notions and maybe look at it with a clear set of eyes.
Okay. So where do you get those ideas? Because with that, it's like the two-party system in a third way. How do you channel that towards moles going through a mountain?
Well, I guess the idea of trying to communicate to people that there should be more than two ways to do something is just something that has been personally really important to me for a very long time, just in terms of the way that our government works. And as far as thinking of a way to express that through metaphor and through satire, I think initially I had thought about this in terms of ants. I think was the first way that I had approached it. And then that seemed like ants were maybe just like a little bit too alien, or that might turn people off. And so I was trying to think of almost in terms of like a fairy tale, just like a small lovable creature that could kind of sneak this message into people when they're getting kind of distracted by these cute little animals that are engaging in this almost kind of fairy tale behavior of trying to dig through this mountain. And then as you're reading it, it sort of dawns on you that there's something much larger happening here. And then things start to even get a little violent, get a little serious. And so I try to bring that on subtly.
Right. And I can tell you that when I read it with my students, they always like, why do they kill off the one section of moles, and it really creates that two-party system in a way, and it gives the students more of the abstract thought to talk about, well, why do we have to vote only two ways when it comes to elections?
Right, yeah, and so that's the idea behind also framing it from the perspective of Henry, who kind of acts as the opportunity for the reader to put themselves in his shoes and kind of be forced with these two extreme options on either side, where you have this ultra traditional sect of moles, and then you have this other kind of radical sect of moles that is kind of destroying the environment and doing everything it can at all costs. And so I'm trying to sort of put the reader in the position of the protagonist to think about things in those terms. And then maybe when you get done with the story, it might occur to you, oh, maybe this is also something that's applicable to other things in our life.
Well, I think so too. And when you talk about at least the story with the moles, both factions are trying to get to the same like end goal, and I think that's what we see in politics too. Is no matter what the politicians are, they have this end goal, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's usually the American dream or how America should be, and they just go two different ways, but the end goal is to have the same goal at the end of it.
Exactly, yeah. And that's something that I am sympathetic to and try not to be overly judgmental of, even though that can sometimes be easy. I try to understand that a lot of times the people that are in these situations, be it at either extreme, I think that they truly do have good hearts and they have good intentions, and they do believe for whatever reason that that their methods are the best way of achieving happiness for society. I think that's right. I don't think there's anything that's necessarily malicious about it, and that's something that I also tried to get through in the story, is that I don't think that either one of those groups of moles, either the Gansevoort family or Thomas's crew, is necessarily malicious, and they really are both just trying to accomplish the same thing, which is kind of get through to the other side, get through to this paradise, and that's what everyone's trying to accomplish, just in their own way.
Right. So I know you're a proponent for this theory of rank voting or rank ballot voting. And so I would like to give you a couple minutes of explaining what that would be and why would it be beneficial for, let's say, democracy? Because I would imagine there's some people out there who say that's unpatriotic and undemocratic to have ranking your elected officials.
Yeah, so usually how we refer to this is ranked choice voting. And maybe before we even get to explaining what ranked choice voting is, it might be good to explain maybe what the theory is behind how we have gotten into such a polarized political climate, if that's okay with you.
Let's discuss.
Okay, so and this is obviously, there are a lot of different opinions on this, and this is just my kind of pet theory on this, but the way that the American system of government is structured, and we have a very, very old system of government for a democracy. It's been around for hundreds of years, and when it was first devised, this country looked very different. It was much, much smaller, at a much, much smaller population, and so the Constitution that was put in place at that time was meant for a very different country than the one that we live in today. Yet we're still largely using all of those same rules in order to run a country that is just many, many times larger, both geographically and in terms of population. And so the metaphor that is sometimes used here is that this is like a grown man wearing a child's clothes. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in now. But even all throughout our history, the two-party system has been a problem. Pretty quickly after the Constitution was even ratified, we started to realize that everybody was sort of just going to sort into these two major parties. And that has been the case pretty much since the end of the 18th century. Okay. Is that we've had this situation. And the primary reason that we have that in this system is because we have something called first past the post voting. And what that means is that whoever gets a bare majority of the votes wins an election. So even if you win 51%, or even if you win 50.1%, you still end up winning that seat. And so the problem is that not only does this sometimes leave people out in the cold, it could leave what's very close to half of the population out in the cold. Because somebody's being elected that they didn't vote for, and there's a very large constituency of the population that isn't being represented. But also the problem with the two-party system in this sense is that it really discourages third parties. It discourages a multi-party system, because what you always hear from people that would try to be a proponent of a third party is, well, you're just going to be a spoiler. You're just going to make it so that the better of these two sides isn't able to win. And that's the thing that people are really always concerned about with respect to voting for two parties. And so what ranked choice voting does in order to attempt to cure this is it takes away the spoiler effect of third party voting. And the simplest way that I can try to describe this is, let's say you're somebody that really believes in the Green Party platform,
Yeah.
right? So you're somebody that really cares about the environment, you really care about these progressive issues, but you don't really have an opportunity to vote for Green Party members that have any realistic chance of winning any elections, right? And so the Democratic Party would probably tell you, look, if you vote for Green Party candidates, you're just being a spoiler. You might as well just be voting for Republicans, because the only candidate that can be a Republican is a Democrat. So you are wasting your vote if you vote for a Green Party candidate or if you vote for a third party. And the problem with this is that they're unfortunately correct. You are more or less, in our current system, wasting your vote. That is true. It's unfortunate and it's not fair, but that is correct. And so what ranked choice voting does is it allows you to rank all of the candidates that are on the ballot. So let's say that there is a Republican and a Democrat and a Green Party candidate and a Libertarian candidate. And so you, being a supporter of the Green Party, can go in and say, look, my first choice is for the Green Party candidate. But if they can't win, if they don't get enough votes, then my second choice is for the Democratic candidate, my third for the Libertarian, my fourth for the Republican. And so that way, you still get an opportunity to voice what is your first preference, but in the event that that candidate isn't viable and isn't actually able to win the election, you still get to vote for the Democratic candidate that would have an opportunity to beat the Republican in this example. And the way that it works is, in the first round of voting, all of the first place votes are counted. So everybody that cast their first vote for a Democrat, a Republican, Green Party, and Libertarian, those are all counted. And whoever has the least of those, let's say in our hypothetical here, it's the Libertarian Party gets the least votes as a first place vote, then whoever all of those voters voted for second, that's where their vote goes. And then you do that with the next lowest and on up until somebody gets to 50% of the vote. And so sometimes this may result in the same result that you would get even in first past the post voting. But hopefully what it would do is encourage people to not be scared anymore of voting for third parties or independent candidates, because you're removing that spoiler effect. The major parties, the two major parties, Republicans and Democrats, would no longer be able to say to you, look, you're throwing away your vote, you need to vote for one of us. It would take away a lot of power from the Republican and Democratic parties, who right now have all of the power in our electoral system, and it would make it so that they can't shame people anymore for trying to vote their conscience.
Okay. So I know in the 2016 election, a lot of people were just saying, I have to vote for the worst candidates of all time. I have to pick the lesser of two evils. Do you think ranked choice voting would have played out differently in 2016 if that was the case, that we had it?
Would the election have turned out differently?
That, or do you think that and also would it squash that debate about the lesser of two evils?
Well, it would definitely squash the debate about the lesser of two evils, because that just wouldn't exist anymore. That phrase would probably even go out of existence in a society that has ranked choice voting, because you would never be put in that position. You can always vote for the person that you want the most, even if you think they have a relatively bad chance of winning the election. But the other good thing about that is that other people start thinking that way too. So then you get a crowd of people that are all voting for that person now when they otherwise wouldn't have, because they were afraid of serving as a spoiler in the election. So you start to see a much more accurate representation of how the population actually feels. It might be that there are a lot of people in society right now that actually would vote for the Green Party, would vote Libertarian, would vote for maybe some kind of centrist candidate, would vote for a very progressive candidate or a very conservative candidate, but they don't have the opportunity to express those preferences, because the Democratic and Republican parties are telling you, look, you need to pick between one of us. And if you don't pick one of us, the other guys that you really don't like, they're going to win. And you don't want that to happen, do you? And so they've really got everyone's backs up against the wall here in this two-party system, trying to force people to choose one or the other.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's kind of like that. It's like the machine that hasn't been broken yet. Right. Because if you look at other countries where like Germany has, I can't even tell you how many parties is in the German parliament, but they get stuff done, you know, and same thing with the UK with the different parties there. And so it would be interesting to see if that was very implemented. Now, have there been some examples of ranked choice voting in America so far?
Well, there have been some examples even throughout the rest of the world where it has worked pretty well. This is something that they do in Ireland, and there were just elections. There's a general election in Ireland, I think in February, and Sinn Féin, which was historically a third party and had never been able to really get a foothold in the Irish Parliament, was finally able to do so. And that I'm almost certain is because they have ranked choice voting.
Okay.
There are also some places in the United States, though, that have become kind of the early adopters of this method of voting. One of the places that you first saw it was in Maine. And the reason that it became popular there is because they had a situation where they had a very unpopular Republican governor, I think his name was LePage, who kept on winning that seat with a minority of the vote. And the way that he was able to do that was because they would often have independents that were running, that were splitting the vote between the independent and the Democrat. And what the people in Maine felt was, look, if we were able to accurately reflect our preferences here, we think that if you combined the votes of the independents and the Democrats, they would probably pick the same person at the end of the day. So it isn't fair that this Republican governor keeps winning this seat with a minority or a plurality, but less than 50% of the vote. And so ranked choice voting would be something that's really good for us here. And it turned out, sure enough, as soon as they adopted ranked choice voting, that he lost his seat. And that was exactly what they predicted. But it was a good thing for that state because it more accurately reflects the will of the people. Where else we've seen it is more on the local level. I don't believe that any other states have adopted it statewide, but New York City is now considering it for local elections. I think they may even be doing it in their upcoming elections in 2020. I believe cities like San Francisco do this for their local elections, maybe Minneapolis or St. Paul, I believe do so as well. So this is something that's being tested at the local level. And consistently when people who engage in ranked choice voting are polled about it, they express a lot more satisfaction with democracy because immediately they find that this is a much fairer system. This actually makes people want to go out and vote, where sometimes they might feel, what's the point? It's just the two major parties. I don't care which one wins anyway. There's a lot of apathy. But ranked choice voting gives people, I think, the opportunity to feel like they're actually engaging in democracy a little more than many Americans currently feel.
Right. And I think with the choices of ranking them, not only do you get to expand your voice about who do you want in office, right? But who would be better for that position. And also, like you were saying, to have an accurate representation of what America's demographics look like from, let's say, district to district or even state to state. I want to touch upon the Electoral College. So you said that like this two-party system is out to date. And by the way, didn't George Washington warn us in his farewell speech of avoiding those two factions?
He sure did. Yeah, I'm not sure that he was really able to anticipate what would eventually occur. But yeah, I mean, it's something that was a concern from the very beginning. It was something that Madison was very concerned with as well. He wrote a lot about factionalism and how this wasn't a government that was set up to withstand factionalism. And political parties are not an invention of the founding fathers. James Madison did not write political parties into the Constitution. This is something that the American people developed over time in order to try to control power and enable to wield political power. This is not something that has to be a part of our government. It's something that we've just kind of accepted as part of the American way of life, but there's absolutely nothing that requires us to continue on this way.
Okay. So with the notion of not continuing on this way. What are your thoughts about the Electoral College? Because I know a lot of people think that's out of date, but it does help us elect the presidents that we have.
Helps us elect the presidents we have in what regard?
Well, from my understanding, the Electoral College was put into place to make not the, let's say, miseducated or misinformed people not electing people that shouldn't be in power. Is that correct?
Well, yes, the way that it was initially put into place is that would have been the idea when you actually had electors that were not bound by the will of the people that voted for them, that could then go and vote for a man of virtue that they thought would be a good president. But in actuality, that's just not the way at all that it works anymore. The Electoral College was also put into place because it was a benefit to slave states. Basically, it was that slave states would get more electors than the non-slave states would, because slaves counted as a fraction of a person, and so that would give them more electors than the non-slave states.
All right, but I'm confused. Wasn't like slaves property though? So why would they be a fraction of people if they were property?
Well, because that's the way that the slave states argued for it, was that they wanted additional representation in Congress. They wanted more representatives. They wanted more electors. And that was something that they argued for at the Constitutional Convention, was that even, so yes, if you're trying to frame it as hypocritical of them, then certainly, I mean, hypocrisy is the least of their sins. But yeah, they had a lot of them, and that was certainly one of them. So yeah, that is an unfortunate relic from that time, I think, the Electoral College.
Okay. So is it outdated, you think?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, there is no other country in the world that uses this kind of system in order to elect their leader. It's a complete relic. It has no place at all anymore in modern society. There really is no good argument for it. The only reason that anybody continues to advocate for it is because they think that it helps them politically. I mean, that's why you often hear Republicans continue to advocate for the necessity of the Electoral College, is because it helps them. If it didn't help them any longer and it suddenly helped Democrats, you would probably very quickly hear Democrats telling you how much we needed to keep the Electoral College, and Republicans would change their tune. I mean, it's always just been something that people rely on for political expediency.
Okay. Well, it'll probably take a while for that to change, if that ever changes. So I guess I want to focus on more of what your thoughts are of our current political climate in the United States.
Sure. Well, before we move on from that, I do want to mention one thing about some potential remedies that we have to the Electoral College, because unfortunately, the Electoral College is built into our Constitution. And so that would actually take an amendment to the Constitution in order to change. But there is something called, I believe it's called the Interstate Popular Vote Compact. And that is something where a number of states, it's something like 25, maybe half of them or so, have entered into this, an agreement, and this is largely blue states that usually vote Democratic. They've entered into this agreement where they've said, what we are going to do in our state is that whoever wins the popular vote for presidency, that's where our state's electoral votes are going to go. And as soon as enough states agree to this, that have a majority of the electoral votes, what we would basically have is the removal of the Electoral College, because you would have enough states that can make a majority in the Electoral College all agree on this, and that would more or less abolish the Electoral College without actually having to amend the Constitution. And I think that a good number of states have agreed so far, but not enough yet that could actually be put in place.
Okay. So a slow moving movement, if you will, or growing movement, and then it would be based on popular vote?
Right, and then it would be whoever wins the popular vote, then all of the states that have entered into this compact would agree to have their electors vote for that person, even if that person didn't necessarily win their state.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that there was a loophole.
Well, they're trying to make a loophole, but not yet.
Not yet.
But this is something people are thinking about.
Okay, cool. Anything else about the Electoral College?
No, I think maybe, yeah, let's move on to the current political climate, because I think that that is something that still does, I think, also very much involve our two-party system.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be doing a lot of bad-mouthing of the two-party system today. So my theory on this, again, I already talked a little bit about how the two-party system has been a problem almost since America was founded. It was a problem during the Civil War. It was a problem throughout the early 20th century. But there did become a time, maybe shortly after World War II, where we did have a period of time where it seemed as if the two-party system was working. And this was a time where you basically had the Democratic and Republican parties organized around an economic axis. And so when we talk about the Democratic and Republican parties, historically, it means very different things depending on what era of history you're talking about. These parties don't have coherent ideals throughout history. It's constantly changing. The Republican Party today has nothing to do with the Republican Party of 100 years ago. And so in this post-World War II period, you had the Republican Party that was basically the party of the managerial class, the wealthier class, and you had a Democratic Party that was largely the party of the working class. But what that meant was, because the parties were very organized around an economic axis, is that there was a lot of cultural diversity and identity diversity within those parties. And so you could have, for example, more liberal-leaning Republicans, and you did have that in the Northeast especially, and then you could have more conservative Republicans, speaking culturally, that is. And then the same thing with respect to the Democratic Party. You had more conservative Democrats, especially in the South at that time, and then you had more progressive Democrats that were living in the cities in the North and out West. And so there was still a lot of diversity within the parties in terms of culture and identity. But there was also some ways in which that was a very bad thing, because there was clearly a lot of discrimination at that time, and those were things that needed to be cured. And so what ended up happening was that the Democratic Party eventually became the party of civil rights. And so throughout the 60s, you got the Democratic Party championing things like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And what ended up happening to the Democratic Party was that all of the conservative working class people within that party started to realize, well, this isn't the party for me anymore. And these are also just sometimes blatantly racist people that decided, well, the Democratic Party isn't my home anymore. They started migrating to the Republican Party. And you had some more liberally minded people, even wealthier people within the Republican Party, that also started to realize, well, this isn't really the home for me anymore. And they started to migrate to the Democratic Party. And so this is a change that happened over several decades, especially during the 90s and the 2000s, up until we got to, let's say, the 2016 election, where this had really solidified in an extreme way, where you now had a Republican Party and a Democratic Party that were not at all organized anymore around an economic axis. They were almost entirely organized around cultural and identity axes. So you had a Republican Party that had both very wealthy people at the top and very poor and working class people at the bottom, but that all had similar cultural values. They all had more traditional and rural values. And then you had a Democratic Party, which also had very wealthy people at the top and a lot of working class people at the bottom, but that all tended to have more urban and cosmopolitan values in terms of culture. And when you have two political parties, and they're the only two political parties in your country, and they are organized around a cultural axis without an economic component to them, that is a really big problem for a couple of reasons. Okay, first of all, because that means that the wealthiest part of both of those parties are just going to control everything. They're never going to be looking out for the interests of the lower class people in their parties. So you have these two parties right now in this country, the Democratic and the Republican Party, that are basically just run by these wealthy elite oligarchs. The next really big problem with that is that when you have people that are not agreeing with one another solely based on issues of culture and identity, that leads to much more toxic partisanship than when people are just not agreeing on how the government should be spending its money. These are things that people identify with very strongly. It's something that they feel are their core values, and it is very, very hard to have a conversation with somebody that you see as being an enemy to your identity and your core values. And that's really the situation that we find ourselves in now, is that it's very, very hard for people to look across the aisle and see themselves there at all. What they see is something that is a direct threat to their very existence and their very identity. And that's why you get, I think, a lot of the rhetoric that you get now between the Democratic and Republican parties. And so again, I think that this was just kind of an inevitability of the two-party system sorting out this way. And that's my theory, at least, as to kind of how we've arrived at this moment.
Interesting. So when you're talking about identity politics, could you give us some examples of what topics people are voting for solely that impacts all of us?
Well, I think it really depends on the individual people. I mean, I don't even mean identity necessarily just in terms of things like race and gender, but there's certainly a cultural identity that exists in America where everybody really has an understanding pretty easily. When you say red state or blue state, there are things that immediately come to people's minds. They understand a caricature of a person based on you saying one of those two labels. And that is something that unfortunately does exist. And so when you have people sorted into these two partisan positions based on those cultural identifiers, this is the situation that you end up in. As to how any individual person is voting, I mean, that's really hard to say, I think, because it's going to be subjective based on the person.
It's very interesting because you're saying that we're tending to go away from economic impacts, or at least that's the way people voting. And now it's turning into like a social war in a way where if I'm on one side, I have to believe this, this, and this. And then the person on the opposite side believes the complete opposite of that. Is that a fair assessment to say that now it's going away from like what's best for the economy and basically what is the American culture?
Yeah, and it's even going away from what's in people's individual best economic interests, right? So, I mean, you have people that are very wealthy within the Democratic Party right now who are not even looking out for necessarily their best economic interests. And you have people that are very poor in the Republican Party who are not necessarily looking out for their best economic interests. And so, yeah, we really have gotten to the point where politics is really just being waged as a culture war. And I think that there are a lot of other reasons for that. I'm sure that media has a big role to play in that. I'm sure that social media has a big role to play in that as well.
No, I mean, I agree, especially like what we found in the last, 10 years where people that were putting political messages on like Facebook, that would only filter to the algorithm of other people like-minded. So it seemed like there was these two bubbles that nobody knew. And it seemed like after 2016, that's when it was really exposed, because I think a lot of people on the left didn't expect to see President Trump be elected. And then now it seems like a lot of the Republicans that I've seen are kind of appalled that people would actually vote for, like, let's say your boy Governor Cuomo or Pelosi or stuff like that. So it's very interesting how social media is doing it, because it seems like if you put something out there on the web, the algorithm will lead you to your own kind of thoughts in a way, or at least lead you to not exposing you to the rest of the viewpoints.
Yeah, I would say it's not even just the algorithm. That certainly plays into it, but I think that we also deserve a little of the fault here too. I mean, there's some selective self-sorting here as well, that people choose to only follow certain things on Facebook or on Twitter, and they kind of curate their own experience to make them feel better about the values that they've chosen to identify with, and they have that option with those kind of platforms. So I think we're at fault as well.
No, I agree. And so lately I've been going on like a Neil deGrasse Tyson kick. And there's like 12 to like 30 interviews of him saying basically the same thing. But I wanted to hear your take on this, because when I was watching some of his podcasts with, like, let's say Joe Rogan, or even like an interview of like the Today Show, he's kept on repeating something that really like kind of struck a chord to me. And I would like to know what your thoughts are. So I'm going to just read you a few quotes that I thought could apply to our conversation.
Sure.
One is, you cannot have a functioning democracy with an uninformed electorate, because then politicians can pull wool over their eyes and be duped. Then he goes on to say, you know what science literacy is? It's inoculation, or a vaccine, against other people who would exploit your ignorance for their gain, be it political, cultural, or economic gain. Do you have any thoughts about that? Because I thought out of all of this whole like information sharing, that one spoke true to me when it comes to the democracy that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard not to agree with him in general. I guess here's the way that I would maybe add a caveat to what he says about information kind of being the remedy to being taken advantage of by the government, is that I think that largely that's true on the macro sense. And it's true over long periods of time. If somebody is exposed to good information over maybe even several years, if you're in a culture where you're constantly getting exposed to good information, if you've been educated well and you're being exposed to that information, I think that eventually that's going to turn you into the kind of person that generally has a pretty good and reasonable take on things. You want to use your objective senses in order to evaluate the world. That's probably true on that kind of level. But I think, unfortunately, where the problem lies is that on a micro level, I'm not sure that's necessarily true. And I think that we find that play out all the time. So on just a transactional basis, let's say that someone believes something that's just blatantly false or scientifically false, what you and I would agree is false. And there are a lot of people that do. Just on that micro transactional level, if you were to tell that person, here's the correct information, here's what you should actually believe, I don't believe that that will necessarily do anything to change that person's mind. I think that if anything, I think there's actually some studies that show that when you present people like that with information that is correct and is the opposite of what they believe, what they actually do is they will tend to dig in their heels and believe the thing they already believed in even more strongly, because they have kind of this sense of self-preservation, that they don't want to be wrong, they don't want their worldview to be shaken. And so I think sometimes our instinct is, well, this person is saying something that's false. If I find a really good article that is scientifically supported, I'll just show it to them, and then they'll realize that the thing they think is wrong and they'll think the right thing. And maybe in some small set of circumstances that's true, but I think largely it's not. And I think that that really goes against our instincts. And so I think that a lot of times we're trying to engage with people on that basis in these smaller situations to just try to spread good information, and that will make people change their minds. But I'm not necessarily sure that's true. And I think if you look at American culture over the past several years, where this is something we've been thinking about more and more, I mean, I think it's almost self-evident that it isn't true. I mean, the American people are still very often not believing things that are correct and are believing in things that are scientifically faulty, and it's really hard to change their minds on that smaller day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, to date this podcast, if you will, we're living in a pandemic now, and I think my biggest kind of like what the F moment, or at least kind of head scratcher, is that a lot of people thought this was a hoax. A lot of people don't understand the science of how a virus can wipe out totally population. And the people that are comparing it to the flu or comparing it to any other, let's say, pandemic in the past, I don't think they know the gravity of the situation. And that's where I'm at, Scott. Is like, I don't understand how people went away from science in a way.
Yeah, I mean, but that's almost a perfect example of what I was just talking about, where people, it doesn't actually change their minds to find out the correct information necessarily. So if you have somebody that believes that, and then you share some graphs with them in an article and say, no, this is actually really serious, here's what the World Health Organization is saying about it, here's what these leading scientists are saying about it, I'm not sure it's all that likely that if somebody already was in a position where they were ready to call this a hoax and not believe in it, that you sharing that information with them will change their mind. I think that a lot of times maybe they're getting their influences from a media that they want to believe, and is sharing this information with them, and maybe they're getting it all the way from the top, from our president right now has a sway over a lot of people, and this is something that he said for a very long time when he should have known better, was that it was a hoax, and he downplayed it for a very long time, and that has a powerful impact on people that are already inclined to believe him. So you have to do a lot of work, I think, to recondition the people that think that way. It's probably going to take more than just sharing an article with them.
Right. And we can see that probably the cool thing about the pandemic is that we're at ground zero in a way, because our economy is stopping and we're going further south towards a recession and depression. And so in this time, you know, things can change in America. And so where do you see us going, you know, past this? Because like I said, my big thing is the misinformation and people not taking it seriously about a pandemic, right? So where do you see us going after this pandemic?
Wow, I don't mean that requires a little bit of prognostication.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe let's think about this both in terms of being optimistic and in being cynical. So in terms of optimism and in terms of what we're talking about right now, I mean, I can't even think of, you know, some anecdotal examples from my own life where there are people who I would usually expect to be the kind of people that are not apt to listen to scientists and listen to experts and would maybe believe whatever the president says or what Fox News says instead of those things. And even those sorts of people just over the past couple of weeks have really changed their mind on these kinds of things. And that was a bit surprising to me. They're really taking it seriously, and they're listening to all of the precautions, and they're doing all the right things. And I think that that's probably because this is just such an obviously serious situation with such dire consequences that it's something that can move the needle, when otherwise they don't really see just that real world example of how it's affecting their life. It's much harder with something like climate change, where it seems very hypothetical. It seems like it's in the future. It's really hard to kind of understand on a day-to-day basis how that will affect people. But this is something that's much more in people's faces. I mean, they're seeing the economy crash. They're seeing all these hospital beds getting filled up. They're seeing the numbers. And so I think that when you have that very real tangible evidence in front of you, I mean, you kind of have to start to change your thinking about some things. So if we're going to be positive, I think that maybe this would be an opportunity for those people to think about other things in the future and think, well, maybe this is kind of like how I initially wrote off the pandemic, and that turned out to be a really big deal. I mean, that would maybe be the best case scenario, right?
Yeah, we can see about that. I mean, I think you said it the best, like to change people's minds to basically uncondition them to believe what they believe, or at least just the truth, will probably take years. You know, it'll probably take years for that to happen.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I think that that's largely true. I mean, it has a lot to do with what you're being exposed to, your peers, just who you're around, who you're talking to. But I mean, sometimes maybe something that's like a seismic shift like this, something that absolutely just, you know, rocks everybody's everyday life. I mean, who knows? It's really impossible to predict what the effects of something like this are going to be, because it's so unprecedented in the life of anyone who's living today. So maybe something like this will actually make a difference.
Right. I just wanted to say thank you for being our guest on our 5 Senses podcast. It's been really great catching up with you and really picking your brain about our democracy and some other key concepts, at least with the two-party system. So I just want to say thank you. Hope that you're staying warm in quarantine. All right. And of course, go Bills. Like, got to have
Go
a good
Bills,
shot.
baby.
Go Bills. And so for the listeners at home, this wraps up another 5 Senses podcast. For more information, you can go on 5eneses, MAG.com, like us on Facebook and Instagram for more content and more podcasts. Everyone, stay healthy, stay safe, and stay quarantined.